Amara Okonkwo's heart pounded as she walked slowly down the aisle in her flowing white gown, the church filled with music, flowers, and smiling faces. It was the happiest day of her life, and every step brought her closer to Togchukwu Ease, the man she believed she would spend forever with. But just as the pastor's voice rang out, "Who gives this woman away?" her father, Chief Nnamdi Okonkwo, stepped forward, his face drained of color. In a loud, shaking voice, he shouted, "Stop this wedding." The room fell silent, the joy in the air instantly replaced by shock. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Amara froze, clutching her gown, eyes wide with confusion. Nnamdi moved closer to the groom, leaning in to whisper something only Togchukwu could hear. Whatever he said made Togchukwu's eyes widen before he stumbled backward, his face pale, hands trembling. Amara pleaded with her father to explain, but he refused, shaking his head. The pastor tried to restore calm, but whispers spread like wildfire. Then, without warning, Togchukwu's expression twisted in anger, and he turned and stormed out of the church, leaving everyone stunned. Nnamdi led Amara outside, away from the crowd. His voice was unsteady as he told her he had recognized a scar on Togchukwu's hand, the exact scar he had seen on the man who tried to kill him 25 years ago. He revealed that long ago, as a young businessman, he was attacked and left for dead by a masked man. The only clear thing he remembered was that scar. After some digging, it emerged that Togchukwu's father, Obinna Ease, had been imprisoned for that very attack. The scar Togchukwu bore came from an accident linked to that night. He had never known the truth about his father's crime. When Amara's mother broke down and admitted she knew but stayed silent to protect her daughter's happiness, Amara felt her heart shatter. Togchukwu returned, insisting he was not his father, begging to continue the wedding. But Nnamdi stood firm. In tears, Amara removed her veil, walked to her father, and whispered, "I choose you, Papa." The church remained silent as the love story ended before it began. The sound of Chief Nnamdi's voice stopping the ceremony left the church in complete silence. Every guest sat frozen, eyes darting between the bride, the groom, and the man who had just interrupted the happiest moment of his daughter's life. Amara's heart raced as she clutched the fabric of her gown tightly, her knuckles turning white. She looked at her father with pleading eyes, searching for any sign of explanation, but his gaze was fixed firmly on Togchukwu. Slowly, Nnamdi stepped closer to the groom. The clicking of cameras and the hushed murmurs of the guests filled the tense air. Nnamdi's tall frame leaned in until his lips were just inches from Togchukwu's ear. His voice was low, but the weight of his words hit like a thunderclap. As the sentence left his mouth, Togchukwu's face drained of color. His eyes widened in disbelief, his lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no sound came out. He took a stumbling step backward, his polished shoes scraping against the tiled floor. The confident groom who had been smiling moments ago now stood trembling, his chest rising and falling quickly, as if the air had suddenly become too heavy to breathe. Gasps and whispers rippled through the pews as people leaned toward one another, desperate to guess what had just been said. Some guests instinctively reached for their phones, recording every moment, sensing this was something no one would believe without proof. Amara turned sharply to Togchukwu, her voice breaking as she asked, "What did he say to you?" But Togchukwu's eyes never left Nnamdi's face. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists, and for a long, unbearable moment, the three of them stood locked in a silent triangle of tension. The pastor shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat in an attempt to regain control of the ceremony, but it was clear nothing would continue until the truth was spoken. And in that heavy silence, with the eyes of every guest fixed on them, Amara could feel that whatever her father had whispered had changed everything, and the wedding would never be the same again. Amara's chest tightened as she stepped toward her father, her voice shaking. "Papa, what's going on? Please, tell me." Her eyes were wide, glistening with fear and confusion, but Chief Nnamdi kept his gaze low, his jaw clenched. "Not here," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His refusal only made the tension worse. The guests shifted in their seats, leaning forward to catch every word, their eyes darting between the bride and her father like spectators at a heated match. "Papa, please," Amara tried again, her hand gently grabbing his arm. She was desperate for answers, desperate to know why her wedding, the day she had dreamed of since she was a little girl, was suddenly falling apart before her eyes. But Nnamdi shook his head firmly, his lips pressed tightly together. The pastor stepped forward, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "Brothers and sisters, let us remain in peace," he urged, his voice steady, but even he could feel the electric tension in the air. His words were swallowed by the low hum of whispers that spread from one pew to another. Some guests were already murmuring wild theories. while others raised their phones higher, determined to capture every moment. Amara's breathing quickened. She turned to the guests, embarrassed, feeling dozens of eyes burning into her. Her perfectly pinned veil felt suddenly heavy, her gown suffocating. The music had long stopped, replaced by the rustle of clothes, shuffling feet, and hushed gossip. "Papa, you're scaring me," she whispered, her voice breaking. For a moment, it looked like he might speak, but instead, he glanced toward the church doors where Tokchukwu had stood moments before, now pacing like a caged animal. The pastor tried again. "Chief Namdi, perhaps you can." But Namdi's sharp shake of the head silenced him. His refusal to explain only deepened the mystery, and the weight of it hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Amara stood frozen between the man who had raised her and the man she had promised to marry, her heart pounding with the sinking feeling that no matter what her father said, the day would never go back to how it was just minutes ago. Tokchukwu stood stiffly, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. His breathing grew heavier with each passing second, his eyes locked on Chief Namdi as if he were holding back a flood of words. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and his lips pressed into a hard line. Then, without warning, his face twisted, anger, pain, and humiliation blending into one raw expression. He took a sharp step back, shaking his head, and in a swift, almost violent motion, he turned toward the church doors. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the silent hall as he stormed down the aisle. No one dared to stop him. Amara reached out, her voice trembling. "Tobe, wait." But he didn't turn. His shoulders were rigid, and each step carried the weight of someone who had just been deeply wounded. He pushed the heavy wooden doors open with a force that made them slam against the walls, and in seconds, he was gone. The tension broke like a crack in glass. Guests began shifting uncomfortably, the once neatly arranged rows now restless. Murmurs swelled into full conversations, voices overlapping in confusion and speculation. Some guests leaned across pews to exchange theories, while others, sensing the moment's drama, reached for their phones, recording the chaos to share with the world. A woman in the second row covered her mouth in shock, while a man near the back muttered under his breath, "I knew something wasn't right." The pastor stood awkwardly at the altar, glancing between Amara and Namdi, clearly unsure if the ceremony was still alive or already over. Several guests began gathering their belongings, unsure if there was any point in staying. The shuffling of feet and the squeak of shoes against the tiled floor replaced the once joyful wedding music. Amara stood frozen, watching the church doors swing slightly from the force of Tokchukwu's exit. Her heart pounded, and her mind raced with questions she didn't have answers to. In that moment, the perfect day she had imagined for so long had crumbled before her eyes, and every camera pointed at her seemed to capture not a bride in love, but a woman on the edge of losing everything. Outside the church, the air was heavy and hot, but Amara barely felt it. Her father gripped her hand firmly and led her away from the crowd, his steps urgent. She could feel his palm trembling against hers, his breathing uneven. When they reached a quiet corner behind the building, Namdi finally stopped, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. His usually strong, commanding voice was low and shaky. "Amara," he began, his eyes clouded with something she couldn't read. "There is something I saw, something I cannot ignore." She searched his face, her heart pounding. "Papa, please, tell me." He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the memory that seemed to be haunting him. "I saw his hand," Namdi said slowly. "Your groom, he has a scar. A long, deep scar running across the back of it." Amara blinked, confused. "A scar? So what?" Her father's voice cracked as he continued. "It is the same scar I saw 25 years ago. On the hand of the man who tried to kill me." Amara's breath caught in her throat. "Kill you? What are you saying?" He looked away for a moment, as if the memory pained him too much. "I was a young man then, running my business. One night, I was attacked by someone wearing a mask. He stabbed me and left me for dead. I only saw part of his face, but I will never forget that scar on his hand. It burned into my memory." The image in her father's eyes was not just of a wound, it was of a ghost from the past suddenly standing at her altar. "You're sure it's the same?" she whispered. Namdi nodded slowly, the weight of his certainty pressing between them. "I would bet my life on it." Amara felt her stomach twist, her wedding veil suddenly too tight around her head. In the distance, the church doors swung open, and she caught sight of people spilling out, whispering and pointing. Her perfect day was unraveling faster than she could hold it together, and her father's trembling voice had just set everything on fire. Namdi's eyes darkened as he leaned back against the church wall, the weight of old memories pressing heavily on his shoulders. His voice was low, almost as if speaking too loudly might bring the past rushing back in full force. "Amara," he began, "there's something you've never known about me, something I've kept buried for decades." She stood still, her heart pounding, afraid of what was about to come next. "When I was your age, I was building my business," he continued, his gaze distant. "Life was good, until one night changed everything. I was closing my office late. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. Then out of nowhere, a man appeared. His face was covered with a black mask, and before I could speak, he attacked." Amara's breath hitched. Namdi's hand unconsciously moved to his side, as if the wound still lived there. "He had a knife, sharp, cold, and he drove it into me. I fought, but he was strong. He wanted me dead. He left me bleeding on the ground, certain I wouldn't survive. But God spared me." He paused, his jaw tightening as his eyes glistened. I never saw his full face, only one side when his mask slipped. But there was something else, something impossible to forget. On the back of his right hand, there was a deep, ugly scar. It was long, jagged, like the skin had been torn apart and badly healed. I stared at it in the seconds before he ran away. That image burned into my mind. I could never erase it, no matter how hard I tried. Amara felt a chill run through her despite the heat of the afternoon. "And you think, Tobchukwu?" "I don't think," Namdi cut in firmly. "I know. The moment I saw his hand at the altar, I knew. It's the exact same scar. I'd recognize it anywhere." Amara's knees felt weak, the church bells in the distance sounding like a cruel echo. She realized this wasn't just about her wedding, it was about a ghost from her father's past walking straight into her future. Amara's mind was spinning as her father's words sank deeper. She couldn't believe Tobchukwu could be connected to something so dark, yet the look in Namdi's eyes told her he was certain. In the hours that followed, whispers turned into digging for answers. A few elders in the crowd remembered the old case. One by one, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It turned out that years ago, Obinna Ease, Tobchukwu's father, had been arrested and convicted for attempted murder. The victim was none other than Chief Namdi himself. The story had been buried over time, known only to older members of the community. Many believed Obinna had been dangerous, but no one spoke openly about it anymore. What struck Namdi the most was how the scar had been passed down in a way no one could have predicted. During the night of the attack, Obinna had injured himself, leaving that unforgettable deep, jagged mark on his right hand. Years later, when Tobchukwu was still a child, a tragic accident occurred. He had been playing near his father, and in the chaos of an argument that turned physical, he suffered a cut in the exact same spot, leaving him with a scar almost identical to his father's. The resemblance was so precise that for Namdi, seeing it was like being transported back to the night he almost died. But the most painful twist of all was that Tobchukwu himself had no idea. His mother had raised him far from the shadow of his father's crime, telling him only that his father had made mistakes, and that the scar came from a clumsy childhood fall. As the truth surfaced, Amara felt torn in two. On one hand, this was the man she loved, someone she believed was kind, loyal, and nothing like the criminal her father described. On the other hand, the evidence was undeniable, and her father's fear was real. The man she was supposed to marry was now tangled in a history of blood and betrayal he didn't even know existed, and that truth was about to tear their wedding apart forever. Amara stood in the small church office, her thoughts colliding like crashing waves. Her father's accusations still echoed in her ears when the door creaked open and her mother, Ngozi, stepped inside. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hands trembling as she closed the door behind her. She didn't look like the calm, graceful woman Amara had always known. Instead, she looked weighed down by a secret too heavy to carry. "Amara," she began softly, her voice breaking almost immediately. "There is something I must tell you." Amara's stomach tightened. "Mama, please don't tell me you knew about this." Tears spilled down Ngozi's cheeks before she could even respond. "I knew," she whispered. Amara froze, her breath catching in her throat. "You knew? And you said nothing?" Her mother nodded, covering her face with both hands as sobs shook her shoulders. "I knew who Tobchukwu's father was from the very beginning. I knew about the scar, the past, all of it. But I stayed silent because I saw how happy you were. I thought, if I ignored the past, it would never touch you. I was wrong." Amara's chest burned with anger and betrayal. "You let me plan my whole life around this man without telling me? You let me stand here in a wedding dress while my father's past was waiting to explode?" Her voice cracked under the weight of the words. Ngozi reached for her daughter's hand, but Amara pulled back, her eyes brimming with hurt. "I thought I was protecting you," Ngozi cried. I didn't want you to carry the burden of something you had no part in. I thought love would be enough to erase the past, but for Amara, the damage was done. Her heart ached not just from the possibility of losing Tobchukwu, but from the realization that her own mother had hidden the truth. In that moment, it felt like the people she trusted most had built her happiness on a lie, and now it was collapsing around her, piece by piece. The church doors swung open with a loud creak, and every head turned. Tobchukwu stepped back inside, his suit slightly wrinkled, his eyes burning with a mix of hurt and determination. He walked straight down the aisle, ignoring the whispers and stares, until he stood face to face with Amara and her father. His voice was firm, cutting through the tense silence. This wedding is not over. I am not my father, and I will not let his past destroy my future. Amara's eyes welled up as she looked at him. She wanted to believe him, to hold on to the love they had built. But Chief Namdi's face remained hard, his stance unshaken. You carry his blood, Tobchukwu, Namdi said coldly. You are the son of the man who tried to kill me. I cannot allow my daughter to marry into that. Tobchukwu's jaw tightened. With all due respect, sir, I had no part in what happened. I didn't choose who my father was. I've lived my life honestly, worked for everything I have. I am not him. His voice cracked slightly, but his eyes stayed locked on Namdi's. The guests sat frozen, the air heavy with the weight of history and pain. Amara's hands trembled at her sides. She could see both men were speaking from places of deep conviction, one from the scars of the past, the other from the desperate fight for his future. You may not be him, Namdi said, his tone softer but still firm, but every time I look at you, I will remember the night I nearly lost my life. I will remember the scar, the fear, the blood. And I will not let my daughter walk into that shadow. Tobchukwu's shoulders dropped as the reality sank in. He glanced at Amara, his eyes silently pleading, but she couldn't move. The church was so quiet that even the soft rustle of her veil sounded loud. And in that crushing silence, it became clear, love alone would not be enough to bridge the gap between the past and the future. Amara stood frozen between the two men who meant the most to her, the one who had raised her and the one she had dreamed of building a life with. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the murmurs from the guests. Tears blurred her vision as she looked at Tobchukwu, his face a mix of desperation and heartbreak. She wanted to run into his arms, but her father's trembling yet firm presence anchored her in place. For a long moment, no one moved. The pastor shifted uneasily at the altar, the guests holding their breath, waiting to see which way she would turn. Her chest rose and fell heavily as she reached up with trembling fingers and slowly removed her veil. It slipped from her hair and fell into her hands like a fragile piece of her dream breaking away. She walked toward her father, each step echoing in the silent church. Tobchukwu's eyes followed her, the hope in them fading with every movement she made. When she reached Namdi, her lips quivered, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, I choose you, Papa. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people wiped their eyes, others shook their heads in disbelief. Tobchukwu stood frozen for a second before turning away, his shoulders sagging, and walked out of the church without looking back. Amara didn't move. Her father's arm came around her, pulling her close, but she felt no relief, only a hollow ache where her joy used to be. The guests began to leave quietly, their footsteps soft against the floor. Outside, a few lingered, already replaying the moment on their phones. By nightfall, the video of Amara's choice had flooded social media. Some praised her father, calling him a man who protected his daughter at all costs. Others condemned him, saying he destroyed her happiness over a ghost from the past. But inside that silent church, Amara knew one thing for certain. No matter what the world decided, the moment she let go of Tobchukwu's hand, she had lost a part of herself she could never get back.